I wonder how much he was speculating in order to warn or to shock or to make us fearful, or whether he was just predicting.
To forge the narrative.
Hey everybody, welcome to Forge the Narrative. My name is Paul, your host. I'm joined tonight by Adam Camilleri.
Hello everybody.
And Red Powell.
Hey.
We All About Lost Souls podcast. Thank you for joining us. Hey, we know why you're here. This is a very special episode. I told you last week to tune in. You had to, because we have Dan Abnett as our guest. So I'm going to take a break right now. We're going to come back with Mr. Abnett, Red, and myself, and then we'll jump back into the rest of the show right after that. Hold tight.
You're listening to Forge the Narrative.
Hey everybody, welcome to a very special author spotlight on Forge the Narrative. My name is Paul, your host. I'm joined this afternoon by Red Powell.
Hello.
And the legendary Dan Abnett.
Hello.
Dan, thanks for joining us again.
Absolute pleasure.
How's your day going?
Very well. Yes, very well. Very creative, productive week, actually. I've been incredibly busy. I'm in the midst of an enormous project that I'm not really allowed to talk about, but it's proving to be enormously good fun.
Oh.
And I just spent the day, we're all in lockdown here, and it's also snowed, so there's no going out. There's no escaping it. And I think I've produced, just in the last hour or so before I came on here, about 5 pages worth of vocabulary that I need to use in the bit I'm trying to write, because it's getting very complicated. And oh my goodness, I don't think I've ever had a single project that's generated so much notes and material. I've barely started, and I've already got 100 pages of notes that I'm pouring into it. And that's ridiculous by anybody's standards, but it's unusual by my standards, because I very seldom make much in the way of any kind of preparatory notes before I go into something. So as you can imagine, my brain's exploding.
I want to ask so bad, but I won't. I've got a topic here that I'd like to discuss with you, but if you could just see the look on my face, it's such restraint.
Well, there are a number. I can't tell you officially, but there are a number of many clues that you can use to guess what I'm probably talking about. And if we had video on, you could probably see the pile of reference books behind me that pretty much give the game away. I didn't put them there deliberately as a sort of visual clue, but my goodness.
No. Well, I can't wait to see where that goes, and we'll have to have you on sometime in the future to discuss this.
I think that's almost obligatory.
So, yeah, I mean, being this is a 40K show, and for the most part, we talk about the art of war, things of that nature, and how to make war with little figures on the tabletop. But a bigger topic that I wanted to discuss was the potential effects of war, specifically world wars, but doesn't have to be, on literature itself. What got us to the point of having stories like this? And, I thought, since you were so amazing at writing war, you'd be a great person to have on and talk about it with.
Sure. It's interesting. I think it, to my mind, it branches from a number of different routes. I think we've always going back through the history of literature, there's always been what might be described as apocalyptic fiction or apocalyptic writing, which have talked about conflagration, often war, but other great disasters, because we have a propensity to sort of imagine that those things will befall us. Every generation has imagined that something terrible is on its way. It's nothing new there, and it goes back throughout history. And war is the most obvious agent of that, and so we get back long before there was such a thing as a world war. We get fiction that is actually predicts and imagines as part of the ongoing thrust of science fiction to predict what will happen and how things will evolve and what they will be like. So I think there's always been that. So the parallel courses of people imagining and predicting and indeed warning about those sorts of things, and obviously a very, very strong and long-lasting legacy of what might be described as military literature. That is to say, people actually writing about the craft and history of war as something that is something that we should know more about. From my own point of view, I think I've probably said this to you when we last spoke, but Warhammer 40k and Warhammer came out a tabletop game. The game was an effort to kind of systemize a way of replicating the tactics of war on the tabletop. So it was sort of, I guess, making war itself, which is a huge and terrible thing, into a much smaller and more entertaining thing that at least allowed us to look at strategies and tactics in a kind of abstract way. And when I came along as one of many people to start writing books in these universes, and let's face it, I've written about war in other places as well, but particularly here, the clue is in the title, Warhammer. It was really, first of all, the first objective was to create fiction that portrayed in some form of realistic way the fanciful war that was the setting of the IP and the narrative. But the more you do that, that's how you begin. You start writing about action and entertainment as if it's some huge, big budget movie in order to entertain the readers. But after a while, that could become repetitive and sort of sterile. There's nothing to it. It's just one explosion after another. And I think that's where I and other authors at the Black Library and other authors of military science fiction have started to think about war, or sort of going back to the more speculative ideas about war that are contained in the body of science fiction and in the body of literature generally, to think about war, what war might be like on different scales, and also to the sort of the morals and ethics of war and the operation of war as a mechanism, whether it is something that is truly directed and controlled by humanity or something that once it starts sort of gets out of control and it becomes an improvisational thing. So I think that's it. If I'd written one or two Warhammer books, they would just be, my efforts to depict that kind of situation. But I've written so many, it's such a ridiculous number, and some of them are very much keyed into the major wars of the law, that I have more and more and more gone and looked at studies of war and histories of war and predictions of war to see if I can locate anything that I can write about that is more than just a description of what happens. And that's where I suppose it becomes quite interesting, and that's where I suppose I find myself looking at the speculations that others have made. And also, of course, at the same time, and we have mentioned this before, is the research side. I am not a veteran. I have no actual experience of it, so it's something that I research both in terms of the granular detail of the military life and also the grand scale detail of war in order to try and impart some sort of authenticity to what I'm doing.
Oh, that's really cool. So with you mentioned not being a veteran and some of the like going back to the early 19s, the 1900s. It's kind of weird, I was born in the 1900s and had to refer to it as that. But some of the authors, that they mentioned, like some of them were pacifist, but still write these captivating stories about society with the backdrop of war or the backdrop of something horrible happening. And then I've read a lot about the trench poets. From World War I, and what type of influence did that type of writing have on you? And then if you can theorize past that, what do you think type of influence that had on things in between now and then?
Well, I think it's interesting that you mentioned pacifists there as a starting point. Yes, some of the most powerful writing about war has come from people who would describe themselves as pacifists, and that's because pacifists aren't deniers of war. They sort of, in fact, one of the reasons they write so passionately about it is because they think it's a terrible thing, that if we can try and get on without it, it will be a very good thing. So I think some of the greatest analysis of war comes either from those who have experienced it at a low or high level, or those who are adamantly against it and wish to express their concerns about it as vividly as possible, so that we actually stop and think, no, that would be a terrible thing to happen. And I think some of the great speculation has come out of that. You mentioned the war poets of the First World War, and indeed there have been war poets attached to sort of every major war, major or minor. The First World War poets are the most famous, but many of them, pre-war, many of the poets writing about military conflict, I'm thinking particularly of people like Kipling, although they had an air of the melancholy to what they were writing about, they were genuinely triumphant. They were celebratory of the role that the soldier played, the glory of the soldier. And I think the war poets of the First World War delivered a sort of shock to the cultural system. People like Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, there were so many others, but what they often wrote about, and these were soldiers who were there and experienced it, and no one had experienced war, the sort of industrial warfare on the scale of the First World War, the way that they did. And it was a truly shocking event that they felt a huge need to communicate back to people at home who had no idea what was happening. This sort of the idea of the sort of glorious past of even say, should we say, the Napoleonic or Boer war eras, where it was sort of still sort of what might be regarded as traditional warfare of infantrymen and cavalrymen and sort of marching regiments and sort of a codified system of battle, had completely been obliterated by the carnage of the Western Front. And their poems are extraordinarily vivid there. I mean, poems about gas attacks, for instance, about tank warfare, about the sheer inhumanity of what was happening, had an enormous and profoundly lasting influence. And indeed, some of those poets, Wilfred Owen being a really good example, did not survive the process. They were writing from the front line until they were no longer able to write. The Second World War produced great poets too. They're not generally as famous as Owen and Sassoon and their likes, but Keith Douglas springs to mind as an extraordinarily good poet. He was a British soldier in North Africa, and he wrote extremely powerfully about it. Others wrote about the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War itself produced enormous, extraordinary pieces of art, both literature and paintings. The Spanish Civil War, of course, being the first use of the Blitzkrieg method of warfare, which was captured so famously in Picasso's painting Guernica. And again, not only was this done to almost traumatize those who were looking at it, to communicate to them the horror of what was happening. And Guernica as an image is not only big, but it is in sort of Picasso's most famous sort of Cubist style, I suppose, and it seems more nightmarish as a result of that. I think war is such a constant, even though war itself evolves and becomes different things in different generations. War is such a constant; it is always there in the backdrop of literature and art. Sometimes as a prophecy, sometimes as a warning, and sometimes as a celebration. I mean, the efforts of, no matter how pointless a war could be, the efforts of the soldiers serving needs to be sort of remembered and honoured. So all of those things are happening at once. It's an extraordinarily strange melting pot of responses that you get.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. This leads me to more questions, but right? I mean, because I'm more of just a fan of this stuff, you know, or a fan of the war novels, the movies, the action movies, and that kind of stuff, you know. And of course, we all play war as a kid, you know, as cops and robbers kind of thing. Almost, or sometimes we're soldiers, sometimes we're cops and robbers. But you know, as far as like that level of writing, and I guess, do you think that we were just, as a people, more able to communicate these things, or had access to communicate these things? You know, because I think war, you're right. I mean, you kind of mentioned this, but going back to the dawn of time, it is always gruesome. It is always tragic. But now it seems like we got to a point where we could better put those things into descriptors that would then live on to another generation.
I think so. I think that yes. Basically, I think the thing is that if one forgets for a moment the sheer horror of what war actually is, or indeed violence of any sort, cops and robbers, you know, cowboys and Indians, any of the things that are sort of schoolyard games, contain within them a sort of quite difficult element of violence. But they are exuberant. If you take that away for a second, they are exuberant sources of conflict and drama, which of course makes for the greatest stories. So of course they make for great games, and of course they make for exciting things. They make for exciting movies. I am, you know, absolutely unashamed of the fact that I'm quite happy to sit down and watch, I don't know, Where Eagles Dare. You know, it's just, even knowing that it is not in any way a realistic portrayal of war, and it is actually in some respects a glorification of some of the worst excesses of war. And that's just one example. So I think there are those two tracks that for every for Where Eagles Dare could be matched by a more thoughtful examination of war. Something like I'm thinking, for instance, of the it's not a very famous film, A Midnight Clear, which is about soldiers at the end, towards the end of the Second World War, American soldiers in Germany. So there are many pieces of work, films and books that talk about war from the other side, as what might be described as the non-entertainment side. which are very, very important. And I think if we didn't objectify and glorify war in terms of just entertainment, that sort of blockbustery feel of things, then we possibly would be almost afraid of talking about it anyway. So I think it's quite interesting. I think that the more sort of obvious and mindless entertainment that is derived from things like war are there to accustomize us to these things, so that we can then examine them perhaps more closely. So, and I think that's very much the case in. I can't speak for the other writers, but for me in 40K, I mean, I am predominantly writing escapist entertainment. There's no, that's all it is. There's not. I suppose there's not meant to be anything deep contained within it, but the more realistically you try and portray it, it is inevitable that you will bump into the things that are there that require a more serious examination, and that is something that I'm now, as I say, prepared to do, because I've committed an enormous number of words to doing this, and essentially it's about time that I looked at it more and more and more, because otherwise it is just repetition. So with things like Gaunt's Ghosts and also things like the Horus Heresy, there is to me a great interest in yes, producing something that will entertain you and you will find exciting, but at the same time remind you that these things, if they were happening for real, would not be without a price, not be without a cost, and would not be achieved without great commitment and sort of I suppose heroism and courage and sacrifice and things like that. And so I think those things walk hand in hand.
Well, I want to challenge you just a little bit on the, not having the intent to have super depth. And I mean, that may not be the intent, but your works do. I mean, there are things in there that make us see like the inner workings, the real lifeblood of the 40K universe that is not just a space marine firing a bolter. And
thank you.
I mean, that's brought such gravity to certain stories, and I love it.
Well, again, thank you. I'm not. I don't think I was saying it wasn't there, and I think nowadays I do make quite a strenuous effort to try and make sure it is there, because I think it would be almost derelict of me not to, because otherwise it would just be a sort of pornographic glorification of something. I've never strayed too far from the idea that, like I said, my primary concern in these things is to entertain you in whatever way I can entertain you. But I think back, I mean, the Gaunt's Ghost series is 15 something books long now so far, and running. And I looked back, in fact, recently I was working on something that required me to go back to the very earliest stories that I wrote, to sort of look at the origins of the timeline and the characters. And I was sort of, I know my writing has developed and I write better stories now than I did then, but I was sort of shocked at how simplistic they were. And they were just a matter of sort of exciting stories with soldiers in them shooting things. But I also noticed how rapidly that changed. And like I said, it wasn't that I thought to myself at any point early on, oh gosh, I've got to make these more serious. I've got to take it more seriously. What I wanted to do was essentially make them more entertaining, and I wanted to give you something to identify with. So as I put effort into making these people into the most real characters that I could, and at the same time was researching things to make things feel as authentic as I could, it is inescapable to then make war itself much more authentic on the page. And that requires you not to look away from the gravity, not to look away from the serious elements. And once those are in the stories, you can't not do them. I mean, it would be very weird of me to suddenly write a Gaunt's Ghost book that didn't have that gravity in the center of it. And that gravity operates on a number of different levels. On the very simple level, it's the consequence of the camaraderie. I've built characters who are friends who work together, and when something bad happens, they feel it, and therefore the reader feels it too, hopefully. But on the same side, particularly as Gaunt has become promoted to higher and higher levels, he's got an overview of the grander scale of things, where the sort of ethics and morality make a difference. So that seriousness operates on two different levels. And I don't think I was really aware of it until I'd written 4 or 5 of the books and in the series, and for other series too. And it sort of it came through reader response. Particularly reader response face to face at conventions. I'm not entirely sure it was the first time it happened, but I really remember vividly the very first American Games Day I attended, which was in Baltimore, and would have been, in the very early, so nearly 20 years ago, I should imagine. I don't know exactly which one it was. But there I met an awful lot of people, and that was the first time I was people who loved the books, and it was lovely, and we got talking to them. But then because of where Baltimore is and how close it is to Annapolis and stuff like that, the number of people that I was meeting who were servicemen or ex-servicemen who were coming along because they read this stuff surprised me. And that was the very first place I got asked. Somebody said to me, "Are you a veteran?" And I went, "No, I'm not." And he said, "Oh, well, then you write particularly well because you've really captured the flavour of it." And that was an enormous compliment, but also a huge surprise. And I was also surprised that people who were either active service or veteran wanted to read these stories, because that surprised me too. I thought, well, either you live war for real and therefore don't want to have anything to do with it in your downtime, or you want to know more about it, but at least want to go to some kind of serious treatment of it because it is a serious part of your life. Yet here they were escaping, it seemed to me, into this entertainment. And I think there was an element of that. I think Warhammer stories offer a celebration of the more admirable aspects of war, the heroism, the courage, the camaraderie, which is very appealing to people. However, it became apparent from that point on and afterwards that actually I was possibly by accident capturing something of what you described as the gravity that was also appealing to people. I say that was I sort of got there by accident. Once I was there, I recognised it and made more of an effort to do something with it and to treat it with the respect and I suppose sensitivity that it deserves. But I got that because the readers told me it was there. I hadn't put it in deliberately, and I was astonished when it was drawn to my attention, and astonished by who was drawing it to my attention. Like I said, which I took if nothing else as a massive compliment. I was really, really sort of dumbfounded by it, but it made me go away and think about it a great deal more. So I think every author responds to and reacts to the feedback they get from the people who read their work. And sometimes that could be small scale and sometimes that can be large scale. But this had a major effect on me. I've always tried to listen to readers, but this particular sort of interest, which has grown over the years, I've always tried to pay huge attention to. Indeed, to the point where I have become sort of friends, at least distant friends, by email and so on, with quite a few people around the world who are servicemen or ex-servicemen in all sorts of different disciplines, who I've met at conventions or talked to online, and they have been brilliant in terms of telling me stuff and supplying me with genuine stories, not that I can then regurgitate in the novels, but as examples of the sorts of things that happen to add that authenticity. And whenever anybody is willing to do that and happy to do that, I always want to listen to it, because it will always be more extraordinary than anything I could possibly imagine.
Oh, you definitely soak it in from what it seems like. And then, I mean, and Red can speak better to this than I can, but it seems to translate like really well.
Oh, I mean, Dan, again, to echo, and I know from last time and what others have already told you, I mean, I appreciate the modesty and the escapist entertainment, but it's, you're writing on the human condition to such an extent. And when it comes to war, for how you've communicated it, and for some of us that may have experienced it, we understand the stakes that are involved in the imperative, just how important it is to one extent or another. And then, something just so amazing with your work and those amongst your profession and the efforts that you've all put into it. It's you're capturing the human condition. You acknowledge that there's a rhythm to the history, right? And how it's played over time previously and how it's playing forward. And a lot of us, just like you mentioned, we've got our own stories that we can see just how that rhythm has played out, and then the extent to which it goes and what you're writing about and what you're able to capture. A lot of us can look back upon our own experiences. And what's so great about the Gaunt's Ghost thing is that Gaunt, whilst, exceedingly human in all of his good and bad, and it, everything that's been captured, he is a good leader. There is a lot of good to him. And like you said, that camaraderie amongst his group, I think that you've really hit on something in your writing of that. And you see it with the Space Marines. You see it amongst these different organizations, these I'll refer to them as kind of tribes in this sense, this culture that has come together in this most ardent effort to accomplish something. And Gaunt is there's a lot captured in Gaunt that you can see throughout history as well, that you've been able to put into your writing, that for a lot of military leaders, I would suggest, you've created a fictional standard that a lot of people can look to and be like, those are things that I would like to emulate as well in a leader. Those are things that I would like to, and it speaks to some of us, and even his failures we see where some of us have portrayed through in other ways. But there's something we say where the character of war changes, but the nature of war is eternal. And you see that all you got to do is remove a couple words, and war is eternal comes out in all sorts of 40K writing. And so it's just been great stuff. And you to your point about how you talked about it changed from the beginning to the end, I think there's a lot to that in the experiential development of not just you as a writer, but the characters and the leaders, and how, as you build all those experiences along, and what it does to those tribes, that the group of comrades along the way. And it's just been so enjoyable to be along for the ride, as well as being able to tie it back to our own rhythm of history and the character of war and whatnot that some of us may have experienced.
Well, first of all, thank you for that. That's a very generous thing to say. I think two things that come out immediately from what we've said there. That one to reiterate what I was saying there is, I think what you said about the character of war changes, but the nature of war doesn't, is the extremely good way of putting it. And I think to me, the aspect of the human condition in these books, the distinction I would make is that in the Gaunt's Ghost books, that element was cumulative and accidental. I essentially found myself doing that because that was the best way I could write the stories, and it was the thing that needed to be looked at. Whereas the great parallel, I think, would be the Horus Heresy books, where from the outset there was a part of the recipe that we had decided that we were going to use for the Horus Heresy series was a requirement to examine the human condition, because it was about the way a culture would change. It was about the way 30K would develop into 40K. It was about the aspiration, if you like, the rules that were set up that got broken. So we, in the Horus Heresy books, where this sort of thing appears quite a lot often on quite a philosophical level, that was very deliberate from the outset. So you can find it there right from the first book, from Horus Rising onwards. You can see that, and we're still writing about it now. So it was never a surprise that was there, because it was built into it. It was sort of baked into it from the beginning, because of the sort of political nature of what we were trying to do. Whereas, as I say, with Gaunt's Ghosts, after a while, I thought to myself, well, I'm writing about war, so I better write about war in all its respects rather than just the superficial ones. And also, I think it organically developed because the Gaunt's Ghost books were very intimate. They were tight in on the characters. These were sort of ordinary people in an ordinary sort of infantry situation. So it was in order to follow their conflict, we had to be on the ground with them and to deal with the mundanity of their lives and the interaction between them and the people around them. And again, in that kind of environment, you can't escape the personal engagement with what war means to people, because otherwise the characters end up being flat and nothing ever happens. And I think that's grown and developed in the same way that my ability to write has grown and developed, in the same way that the characters have evolved down the years. When you write something for a long time, I've always loved the long form. I think I told you last time, I'm a huge fan actually of soap operas, simply because of that idea that it is the cumulative effect that a moment in something that has run for a long time can generate so much more power, because you as the reader or viewer are engaging it not just with what is happening, but with your memory of what has gone before, and that also has a huge effect. So the kind of somewhat artificial impression of Gaunt's career, because let's face it, he's not real, and these books aren't real. But yes, we can plot his career and show not only its history and his deeds and accomplishments in that time, and his failures too, but also could almost see the way his leadership styles and his strategy and his tactics and his decision-making process has evolved to a degree of sophistication that perhaps wasn't there to begin with. Now, that's simply part and parcel of the evolution of it, both subconsciously from my point of view, because I'm writing more and it has to go somewhere. So of course it grows. But also the more I look at him, and I now look at him as Gaunt as a character, obviously as a much older and more experienced man than he was when I started writing him. So he better behave in a much older and more experienced way, and his decisions and his abilities should have grown in that time. And I think that's something that I sort of make quite a lot of effort to try and show. Even show him trying to adjust to that. I think we see that in the most recent book in Anarch. I won't give any spoilers, but there is a fairly major state change in his role, and he doesn't like it. And he sort of struggles to find ways to become good at it as quickly as possible, to almost find the hacks that he needs so that he can start doing the job as well as he was doing his previous job. And I think that's quite an interesting thing to look at. I think one of the things, for instance, one of the things that civilians forget about the military is the very obvious thing is you have to do what you're told to do, and therefore you might be quite happy being one thing in terms of military service. I can't imagine what that particular thing would be, but let's say for the sake of argument, you're a radio operator, and then for some reason you are instructed to retrain and go and do something else instead, and you might not want to do that, but you still got to do it. And the same thing comes with promotion and with the changes in leadership and structures of regiments and stuff like that. Absolutely. Essentially, people are obliged to accommodate all these changes that happen to themselves and to the units they serve with, whether they want them or like them or not. And if they are doing that diligently, then they are trying to accommodate those unwanted changes as quickly as they can, so that their performance of their duty does not suffer in the interim or the long term. And I think that's an interesting thing to look at. I've tried to show that there's certain characters in the stories over the years who have not liked the changes, or have rejected change, or have not wanted to do things, or have even turned down promotions because they don't think they're capable of doing a thing, or that they particularly like doing the thing that they used to do. And then we've seen many other characters, Gaunt being the best example of someone who simply had to get on with it. And as things have been changed and moved around, that like I said, he's tried to life hack his way through that lack of familiarity and find a new way of accomplishing something. So yes, there's realism there, or there is the simulation of realism there, and it's something that interests me because I like the sense of development and growth in the stories.
And so to build on that, this is a future simulation, right? There's all these future concepts tied into it, but again, it still ties back, and so many of us can be familiar with it. And it's not like someone like Gaunt or the experiences that you've portrayed through the entire organization are necessarily unobtainable. It's not like they are beyond, they are not outside of the realm of us as humans and whatnot, and we can even point back. And so that was what really interested me, especially in some of my more recent studies, with taking, Makaroth, the War Master, as kind of almost like Eisenhower during World War II to some degrees, and then seeing Gaunt in almost like a Field Marshal Slim trying to fight the good fight with what he has available in a very difficult position amidst this massive global campaign for World War II, but then expanding that in. And so it's not like, and Field Marshal Slim, it holds a special place for leaders and development of the difficult things, but you're absolutely right. It's not like he didn't start, at that point. There was an experience that continued, a series of experiences that build up to it. And so it's just it's not like all the good things that Gaunt as a leader is able to accomplish is purely fictitious, and it's not mythological. It's actually something that we have historical examples that it can be done. It's just really great to make those ties going forward into it. And again, it's just such an appreciation for what you've been able to do there.
Well, thank you. I think that's interesting. You say obviously a lot of these characters are drawn from inspirations that exist in the real world. Makaroth is many things. You say Eisenhower. That's a great example. To me, he's also Napoleon. He is absolutely Napoleon. almost deliberately so. The Field Marshal Slim reference, I think, is extremely interesting because I hadn't really thought about that, but that is a good one. Weirdly, this is going to sound very weird, but weirdly, I often think when I think of Gaunt, I think of Rommel as a standpoint, as somebody who was just terrifically effective and actually, good to his men, allegiances notwithstanding. And I think that you can find parallels all over the place.
Sure.
And I think that's an important thing to do. And whilst I agree that clearly we're talking about a entirely fantastical speculative future version of war, where there are many, many elements that aren't real, that's a given. But nevertheless, an awful lot of those are entirely cosmetic. A las rifle might as well be an M16. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
The operation of infantry and air cover and armor support and field tactics and the sorts of things they do, they are all very much grounded in the real things that soldiers do or have done. And even some of the more spectacularly ridiculous and bigger things could be you can find the parallels. I've talked in the past about the fact that I investigated submarine warfare in order to be able to write Titans effectively. But you can go back the other way. Just because I put, say, a demon or a Titan or something in my story, you can sort of take that with a grain of salt because it is simply the equivalent of something large and dangerous in a contemporary war setting. So I think those things stand. I think the basic underlying mechanisms, like I said, tactics and strategies to the experience of warfare remain the same, even if Warhammer 40k is sort of, as it were, gussied up by elements of the fantastical. The one key element, and it's something that even that I've tried to steer away, is that often in the wars, more often than not, in real world war environments, there comes a point sooner or later where you can deal with your enemy. That is to say that whatever has been the cause of the dispute, you can come to terms. There could be an armistice, there could be a truce, there could be negotiations for withdrawal, there could be a ceasefire, there could be a trading of prisoners, there could be, there's all sort. You could play football together between the trench lines in no man's land on Christmas Day. All of those things that can happen in sort of human wars, and the obviously the biggest difference in Warhammer is that more often than not the enemies are alien or entirely undealable with. You can't have those sorts of stories that are often quite the most interesting and touching stories about real war. They are more difficult to find parallels to. But even there, and certainly with Chaos, where Chaos is such a malign force, it's almost like a plague or a virus that you can't deal with people because it's not simply a matter of they're an enemy and we've got a political difference. It's much more fundamental than that. But even there, in the Gaunt's Ghost books, I've tried to, for want of a better word, humanize the enemy to such an extent that there can be grey areas in the story. There can be areas where it's not a simple matter of we must destroy them, simply because it produces a much more nuanced and interesting consequence in the way the stories work. And I think the addition of those things it's interesting because actually in a way they are efforts to sort of write these stories slightly off the nose. So you use the word just now. You use the word mythological, and I think about the Horus Heresy books are absolutely mythological. They are about demigod characters for the most part, and they are the foundational myth of the entire 40k universe. So actually, the injection of a realistic attitude to them and to the politics and to the morals and ethics of that was my attempt, and the attempt of the other writers involved, to slightly step it back from purely mythological so that it would be a more engaging read. Because I think if we'd written it in that kind of very, very lofty terms of a sort of myth, it would have not engaged in the same sort of... It would have been interesting, but it would have quickly lost its appeal. But because we ground them, even the demigods, we ground them in some sort of sense that they are at heart, at core, human. I think that sort of draws more out of the Horus Heresy in terms of the fiction than might otherwise have been there. And it's interesting that the same process applied to what might be described the more realistic end, the more realistic human end of the Warhammer universe. To my mind, that's the Imperial Guard and the Astra Militarum, the Gaunt's Ghost books. One of the reasons I wrote about the Imperial Guard first and only is because they were human characters. And I have written Space Marines, and I, love Space Marines, but they are much harder to deal with. I wanted to deal with effectively real humans that we could respond to and recognize. Because that's unchanging no matter where it is. It could wherever in history, real or otherwise, humans are humans, and that's what made those stories, I think, more compelling. So that in other words, what I'm saying is quite interesting that the effort to inject or to incorporate rather an acknowledgement of the human condition happened for both of those series of books. With the Horus Heresy, it happened deliberately. It was deliberately included from the outset in order to move it out of an unattainable mythological status and give it a sort of human heart to make it more accessible. And weirdly, it happened at the other end of the scale, it happened subconsciously and inadvertently in the Gaunt's Ghost books in order to move it into a more serious place, to ground it more seriously. So in both instances, that impulse, both deliberate and accidental or inadvertent, was to steer the thing away from what it appeared very broadly to be. In other words, its very simple form. But both of them were sort of qualifying agencies to try and make those stories work better and in more rounded ways. I hadn't thought of that before, but thank you for pointing it out.
No, thank you. That was amazing.
Talking about how big war can be, fantasy war and that kind of stuff. Like, if I can take us back to War of the Worlds, published in the late 1800s, and how H.G. Wells talked about vaporizing people, death fogs, basically stuff that didn't exist until we got to World War I and World War II, things that weren't there now. And now you're writing things, which 40,000 years in the future, 30,000 years in the future. Are we on a trajectory to where all that stuff is possible? Now, look, I know that there's the kind of like the adage that nothing is too big for 40K, and I want to ask you about that too. Is 40K just so far, with spaceships the size of planets and that kind of stuff? Are we ever going to get there? I don't know, but what is your thoughts on that? Are you even trying to relate to something that we can imagine as humans right now, or do you just suspect that that's going to be the case 40,000 years from now?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think there's a number of different things at work there. First of all, I think H.G. Wells was, like Arthur C. Clarke, was notoriously good at predicting what was likely to happen. I mean, he was particularly good at it. But he was not alone. I mean, science fiction generally has been extremely good at imagining and predicting things long before they happen. Not just war. Sometimes it shocks me at the way some early pulp SF from, for instance, the 20s and 1930s were imagining space travel and principles of faster than light travel that are now, we now sort of take for granted because what I'm saying is they were imagining these things not only before the advent of the television movies that have embedded these things in our consciousness in terms of Star Trek and Star Wars, but they were imagining things before man had even gone into space. They were visualizing it. They were visualizing it in incredible detail. Sometimes it's shocking to see how, as it were, realistic it seems to be. And the same goes for war. H.G. Wells was very good at it, and he wasn't the only one in that era or later, and indeed before. Jules Verne, for instance, was also very good at it. But it's just imagining technological breakthroughs, and war tends to bankroll technological development. So that we see new developments in war before we see them anywhere else. And so it was on the money there where he was imagining these things. And yes, some of the things seem like predictions of World War I and World War II, and things that he himself, I think, was shocked by. I wonder how much he was speculating in order to warn or to shock or to make us fearful, or whether he was just predicting. Because I wonder if it's a case of almost like you make The Simpsons long enough and it seems to predict everything in culture. But I'm sure,
as humans, we can think of horrific things. I mean, we can think about what is the least like, what do we not want to happen to us?
Yeah. Oh, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, you take all the obvious examples. H.G. Wells writing War of the Worlds, Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, William Gibson writing Neuromancer, and essentially inventing not only the internet, but all the terminology for it long before that was even a thing. We can see that these, you take something and you start to extrapolate it in an imaginative way, you get to something that sooner or later will probably become realistic. Now, I think that's I think that's sort of staggering. I think science fiction writers were probably thinking about, atomic weapons long before we actually had usable atomic weapons. These are very obvious things. Now, I think actually when H.G. Wells wrote, and by the way, I believe H.G. Wells was also an incredibly enthusiastic wargamer. I think he actually devised tabletop wargame rules, which something that he has in common, believe it or not, with Peter Cushing, who was also an enormously big fan of those things. Weird that. But anyway, when H.G. Wells was writing The War of the Worlds and sort of apparently predicting the world wars that would come in the century that would follow, and probably a lot of modern weaponry, weapons of mass destruction and things, I think he was charting further ahead than I am when I'm writing Warhammer, weirdly enough, because I'm writing about 30 or 40,000 years in the future, and people are still running around with guns. They're still running around with rifles and throwing grenades at each other and getting into tanks and fighting with swords and stuff like that. And there's a deliberately retro sort of arcane level to the tech. What dresses up 30k and 40k is, of course, the sheer scale, which is something we do theatrically with very deliberately. Things can't be too big. Sort of devastation can't be too massive and all that kind of stuff. But when it comes down to it, it is simply a game of soldiers in a very sort of recognizable, almost out of date fashion in terms of the military technology they're using. I have recently been reading a number of very interesting books about factual books predicting the way warfare will go and how we will depend on all sorts of different things and how it's changing. And some of these things are almost becoming out of date and obsolete as they are being published because we're already doing these things. If you think, for example, of the preponderance already, and will be growing in the next decade, of the use of robots on the battlefield, of remote control devices, of drone warfare, both for observation and surveillance and also for weapons. We're weaponizing drones, all those kind of things. Probably the next generation of combat aircraft will be pilotless in the same way that the next generation of cars will be driverless. We can see that in the next 10 years, we will exceed 40k standards of technology. I mean, okay, we haven't got faster than light travel and we haven't got, fusion cannons. But my point remains is that but I start researching bleeding edge warfare and realize that it's full of ideas that I think are startling and fascinating, but I actually can't use in a Warhammer novel because it would be too advanced. It would be, sort of thing that we'd only possibly see in the hands of the Eldar or the Tau. And I go, well, I can't do that. There is unashamedly a very retro feel to most of the things in Warhammer 40,000 in terms of technology. I mean, that's part of the idea that everything is sort of stagnant and broken, and they're trying to remember how these things work. So there's no developmental progression. Yes, they've got ray guns. Yes, they've got spaceships. But other than that, it's essentially sort of World War II era level of technology, and that's a very deliberate stylistic choice, which I sort of unashamedly enjoy. So I think yes, that those predictions don't quite go in the sorts of way that we expect them going to do. Sometimes I'm almost frustrated about sort of the things that I can't put in to Warhammer simply because it would be the equivalent of alien technology, and there are things that we are already taking for granted. I mean, just think about that, the day-to-day tech. They have switches, for goodness sake. They have switches and knobs and dials.
But some of that's so great, though.
We're all using flat screen devices. I mean, this is, yeah. It's got a really lovely lo-fi feel, which I relish. But, I carry around a smartphone that's more sophisticated than anything that Ibrahim Gaunt's got in his pocket. It's and indeed it's more sophisticated than anything Captain Kirk was carrying as well. So the future becomes out of date very, very fast, even though it still looks like the future.
Man, well, Dan, I want to be respectful of your time. There's so much more we could ask you about. Hopefully we can have you on again in the future.
I'd be very happy to come on. And thank you for such a sort of provocative conversation, though. There were some great things there. I'm actually going to go away now and read more about Field Marshal Slem, so I can see whether I've inadvertently channeled that. But yeah, thanks for a great discussion. I've really enjoyed it.
Dan, we will be back in touch with you very soon. I know people are going to love this segment. Thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you very much indeed.
FTN is brought to you by Discount Games Inc. please visit them at www.discountgamesinc.com. And don't forget to ask Jay about ways to save even more on your hobby projects.
Hey everybody, we are back. Can you believe it? That was an amazing discussion with the legend himself.
Man, what a... I cursed Paul out for a little bit before the show because I didn't know Red was going to be on. I'm like, you absolute... Yeah, but I mean, like, listening to it back, geez, you guys did a great job. And he's a legend of a man. Wow, he's happy to talk, happy to discuss anything. It's so awesome. He's so open and willing with his brain.
He's into his stuff, which is so cool. I mean, that's... Yeah. It was exciting to talk to him about it for sure.
It's just really nice to see that, like, doing what he does isn't just a job to him. He really has a lot of passion for what he does, and yeah, it's great.
Yeah, so prolific. I can't wait to have him. He kind of teased something there at the very beginning, and even in the pre-show we're warming up, he didn't let us know what it was, but I think so. I can't wait to have him on again once we can kind of think, we can kind of theorize maybe about what it was about, but we'll have him on again. I hope.
We know what it was. He was writing the bit where Horace chokes out Sanguinius, and he didn't want to tell you.
Look, I so in my heart, I just want to talk to some of the writers about what I think should happen with Sanguinius.
You want to retcon Sanguinius?
No, I don't want to retcon. No, it has to happen. He has to. So what does Doctor Who say? That
I appreciate that you. Yeah.
There are fixed points in time that cannot be changed, kind of thing.
But time is also a big ball made of wibbly wobbly timey wimey.
Yeah, sure. That's 40K, right? But I think that's a fixed point that absolutely is a pivotal point. It's like it's like certain points in history where there's like the absolute irrecoverable. That's not. You know what I was trying to say there. End of innocence.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole plot of the whole 30-year plot of the Blood Angels has to change if Sanguinius isn't dead.
God, there's a scene, and I'm reading Saturn right now, and there's a scene in there where something happens, and someone's telling Sanguinius is like, "I'm so glad I was here to see it," and Sanguinius just tells him is like, "No, this moment, this heroic moment that you just witnessed is going to be overwritten in 10 seconds by the next heroic moment that someone else does somewhere else in this conflict."
That's huge.
Yeah, and but again, it's just leading up to get into that moment in time that I think cannot be changed. And I don't know if he's writing that or whatever. We got no details, but I just want to expound about what, like, I want to see time freeze when Sanguinius is ultimately killed. And I want him to have all these moments of reflection, like when they say your life passes before you. I want him to see in the future about what the many different things that would have happened if he lived, if he fell, if he this, that, and the other, or whatever. And I want to have a chapter just on that. That's some serious fanfic.
Somebody somewhere is going to write a what if Sanguinius became the War Master and fell and turned what? Like, would he have won? Because he's supposed to be like the closest to the Emperor, like the best. Him or Horus were the best representations of the Emperor, right?
Yeah, well, that's what they actually say in one of the not that specifically, but the reason they have to turn Angron is because Angron is the only one that has a prayer of besting Sanguinius on Angron's best day. Like, Angron has to be at the top of his game and full on rage and infused by the power of chaos to have a prayer of beating Sanguinius.
Well, there's also the
You heard that, Red, right? That's the truth.
So there was
printed.
Bless up.
Also, there was some conjecture and some, me talking with my mates around one of those awful outdoor sitting areas at like a Airbnb before a tournament, talking about how what if some of the Primarchs were given like foresight in order to turn them, because that is what turned Kurz, was the fact that he saw how pointless everything was. He saw the malaise and the decline of his legion in the future and just stopped caring. He just disconnected. Yeah. And what if it wasn't a foregone thing that Sanguinius was going to die, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy because he believed it was what was necessary to defeat Horus?
Well,
because it was planted
Horus
in his head by Zinch or something.
Yes, I mean, same with Horus. I think, wasn't he led down the path of, this is where your statues are going to be? It's not your statues are actually going to bronze you and put you here like a something on a shelf after the war is done.
Taxidermy, yeah.
Like I can't remember if that was what turned him at Davin or part of what turned him at Davin or whatever, but that was certainly part of it, I think.
Well, he definitely was convinced that he was on his own path, right? He was convinced that he was choosing his own way, and that that whole thing with the demoness, I think it was trying to remember her name. But I mean, yeah, that whole Davin adventure, that journey was quite the journey to say the least. And then what came after and later, and as we, what the Horus Heresy was able to capture, like again, that going back to the interview with Dan, taking the mythological and bringing the human condition upon it. I mean, just so much epic writing and lore for us to wrap ourselves in, to be able to appeal to, right? Because you think about the time before the Horus Heresy was written, as far as like these books. I mean, we've been watching this for over a decade now, and you think about it, like there was all the cool art and the amazing, the myth and the legend to how Sanguinius fell.
4 pages in a game book.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's all you had. I mean, we actually made our own novels in our minds. That was the most evocative 4 pages of text, I think.
Oh, sure. There's so much to pull from it. But now with all of the lore that's been written into these novels, we've got this humanist aspect to all these different elements. And it's amazing because now it to a point, it brings us up to their level and brings them down to ours. And there's this compromise that we reach when we're reading that is just such an amazing connection for us all to get to in this lore and hobby that we love so much,
Man, I'm jazzed. No, it's so cool to see this coming to a head with the Siege of Terra, and really looking forward to how they do it. And of course, we know the end, and that's one of the most interesting things is that we know how it ultimately ends, but all the stories that get us there, like what version of there's been 2 tellings of the sacrifice, of what distracts Horus in the end from the Emperor kind of thing. Which one are we going to see? Are we going to see a blend of the 2? I can't wait.
Yeah, you actually touched on something pretty neat there, like spoilers. Because essentially the whole Horus Heresy story was spoiled. Like the whole, would everyone have watched 7-8 seasons of Game of Thrones knowing what the 8th season was going to be like? Hell no. But are we willing to periodically read 100 books of a Horus Heresy series just for an ending we know is going to happen? Yes. I think it's a very unique and awesome thing about our community that not a lot of other facets of nerddom can say.
GW's brought the heat with the authors, though, man. I mean, there's been because there's so many things. Again, we've known some of these. There's been these points in time. We knew about the Drop Site Massacre. We knew about Istvan III. We knew about the Flight of the Eisenstein. There's things that we've known about, but how they've retold it has been epically spectacular. I mean, and that's an understatement.
Oh yeah, like Calth and the Ultramarines and the Word Bearers and how all that played out. Like, I mean, that was just such a deep dive into this lore that we've kind of seen and we knew happened here, but then to actually get it expounded upon to the degree that they did, and then interweaving all the different Primarchs all the way up into Imperium Secundus, man. Like, no wonder the Ultramarines came out of the heresy to the extent that they did. But then given the development of Imperium Secundus and all of it that played into it, was just, man, like mind-blowing.
I actually, and Red, I was giving you some crap earlier, but I actually love what they've done with Angron.
Oh, man. I tell you what, like between that and, have you read Slaves of Darkness yet?
I think I have.
That's the one where Horus essentially is having to bring the demon princes in line. I won't ruin any more of it, but yeah. Like that's where Angron and Fulgrim face off against other traitor Primarchs. Like, man, like, whoa, that's just
no. I just crazy. With the Angron story, it's where, and I think we've mentioned this before in previous shows, but like he needed no convincing. As they were like, we've all turned to Angron's like, okay, I turned like an hour ago. It's fine.
Everything's fine. Yeah. What took you guys so long?
You guys were loyal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love Angron's story. I think it's the most tortured, unfair of all the Primarch stories, and I love there has to be one of them. There has to be one like properly hard done by. It was his fall justified? I think is up for debate. But man, was he a tortured soul that kind of deserved better than what he got? Probably.
He definitely. That's the thing, is that he definitely deserved, I think, better. Like he really, really deserved better. But was he capable of better? That's the real debate.
That's true.
We all get a choice, but if you read Master of Mankind,
that scene is incredible.
Out for him. Yeah. And it almost leaves you to the point of, because like you said, everybody gets a choice. Everybody had some agency in whether they fell or not. But to a certain point, without giving away too much for those that haven't read, I mean, it feels like someone else might have had the decision to make in that regard that they could have prevented it from being an issue. It might have been right or wrong, whichever, but that there were other opportunities to get off the pain train that eventually became Angron.
And he was even, slightly, yes. But read Betrayer, is one of the best novels, period, right? And I know, God, we've heralded it on the show 100 times, but again, that just it's part of Angron's tale, and I think he has a really great story. And I'm not taking anything away from my man Sanguinius. Like, he has the best story. But he also knows the thing about it is he knows what he's in store for. So that's one of the most amazing things about this whole time is that his slight power of foresight, but he never stops doing his duty.
True. Yeah. You want to juxtapose two main characters that have that, put Conrad Curse and Sanguinius next to each other.
That's what I was making that comparison before. The two ways that foresight took them is so interesting.
Man. Yeah, definitely pushed them in absolutely different directions. We go back to the point of agency again and being able to choose, whether to take the high road or the low road. You can clearly see the differences in that and just how their backgrounds played into it and what it did for them. I mean, just so much to that. Again, it's just remarkable the extent that these authors have taken these characters in our collective lore.
Let's go back to that movie Gladiator, where Joaquin Phoenix's character, and I can't remember if this is in a deleted scene or the actual main movie itself. It's been a while since I've seen it, but he's talking about the virtues that his father appreciates.
Oh, that's the main movie. Yeah.
Yeah. And then he starts to go off and spout several different virtues. He's like, "What you don't, do you not honor these virtues, father?" That's like Kurz's story right there.
Oh, yeah, man. I mean, there's just so much to it.
Well, it's just so interesting. Like the Kurz character is incredibly deep. You just think he's a maniac and whatnot, because he starts off as a Batman and ends up as the Joker. It's ridiculously amazing.
Exactly right.
He starts off as a warrior for justice, fighting against injustice, fighting against the oppression that people were facing on Nostromo, where he was, and he ended up being a full-blown psychopathic killer, hell-bent on mayhem. And just that fall into madness is an incredible thing. And the fact that they've pulled that off on that character, the fact that anybody can pull that off at all while still holding up the innumerable other threads of the Horus Heresy is jaw-dropping.
I tell you what, someone who's really taken that to another level, especially with Curse and the Night Lords in general, ADB as an author.
Oh,
man, the Soul Hunter series, that trilogy is just such a, especially with how some of the Horus Heresy takes like Sevatar, the first captain and everything, and portrays it, and then really to continue into that trilogy, which is set in the 40K scenario, and then going forward, he just does such a good job that it really fleshes out a lot of the Night Lords, because I think some people just take him to this, and you kind of see that, I think some people, going back to your analogy, Adam, with the Joker, a lot of people get fascinated when it comes to the backstory and what the Joker is like when he's not just like cackling mad, blowing up bombs and stuff, but like they really get tied into some of his backstory. And I think that Curse has there's the same fascination of his fall from grace almost.
Yeah, I absolutely 100% agree with that. It's weird that there's this sense of nobility attached to some of the legions that aren't attached to others. I have a couple of good mates who are diehard Thousand Sons players, and they talk about how, Thousand Sons are something of an outlier within the legions. They didn't want to fall; their hand was forced, etc., etc. Tizcar was a bastion of knowledge, and they've let go of the Magnus didn't do anything wrong perspective, which is fair, fair enough. But yeah, it's just interesting this sense of nobility attached to essentially like killing machines, which is what Astartes are bred to do. That's their purpose. That's why they exist.
Well, Guilliman. You say that though, but there's one space marine for every world. Like for every human world, there was how many space marines there were. So at the end of all this killing and bloodshed, they were supposed to be turned into peacemakers and poets.
Well, that's what Guilliman tried to do, didn't he? Guilliman tried to make them more, tried to create them into, diplomats and musicians and all these things, and told them to be well-rounded human beings of compassion and thinking, critical thought. And then, you know, by the end of the ADB series, I'm like, oh, guess what? I have fallen in love with mass murderers. Isn't that cute? That's not a line I thought I'd say today, but here we are.
But yeah, here we are. Oh no, I'm right. I'm with you. I mean, as far as that goes, I think that, but that's the thing. The Space Marines are. I mean, they're post-humans.
Mm.
You know, they're supposed to be.
I guess this is why Xenos players get jealous, because we have one faction here of the Imperium, which is an even greater faction that has all this depth, all this love to it, and then Tau players have the two sides of the coin being Shadow Sun and Farsight, or you know Anvar. Now that he's I don't want to spoil anything, but he's not quite there. And
he's the deceiver.
But GW's been very good in building duality into a lot of their factions, building a yin and a yang into every single faction. I'm trying to think if there's one with Necrons.
That's actually, I mean, that's a great thing about 40K. We talk about there are no good guys kind of thing.
Mm.
So how much of this nobility are we making up?
It's just us
ourselves,
us appropriating. Yeah, 100%, man. Yeah. How much of it is just between our ears and just what we want characters to be? I think there is a lot to that. I mean, I think it's obvious that the Ultramarines tick that box. Like they've put a lot of effort into trying to make
everybody knows
Ultramarines
Dante.
feel more. I actually don't know a crapload of Dante's fluff apart from like the early
goodness.
stuff.
Oh,
yeah,
bro. Oh, you thought this was going to be a short show.
Have you come to the right place?
Yeah.
Well, I'll save that. I'll save that for another time. But Dante is.
I'm sorry, we got to make this segue. But you want to talk about some amazing, like a real, just amazing character? How about that Ventress?
Oh, what a dude! Well done,
man.
Well done.
I tell you what, I was just thinking of like who's at the top of my hero list. Probably the captain of the 4th Company of the Ultramarines, who they just made that Primaris model for,
and they just replaced him like Aunt Viv on Fresh Prince.
Yeah. No, I mean, have you guys read any of his books? Have you read any of the Ventress material?
I have not.
No, I have not either. I can't say I'm all that interested in Ultras most of the time.
So you know how, if you were going to tie the Ultramarine aesthetic to any element, what kind of comes to mind? Like, what are the first couple things that come to mind?
Bowl haircuts.
Okay, but that's associated with what kind of culture that you would tie
Roman
to?
culture.
Okay, Roman culture.
Yeah.
So I agree with some of the other aspects that I believe Ventress was maybe initially written before. I think the Roman aspect has always kind of been there, right? Especially with like the helmets and everything that they've
like
gone
Gladius, they've got the sword,
right.
Wreathed helms and
the crested helms. Yeah, yep.
So I think Ventress is essentially what Gilliman has become in the lore of today. If you read a lot of Ventress's older material, he's very much more so into the codex, the theoretical, practical. There's a lot more nitty gritty to him in regards of how it plays out, and less of the Romanesque, governor aspect. He's more of like the codex warrior that breaks it down. But not only does he understand the codex, but he knows when to break the codex. He's like the John McClane of Ultramarines.
There you go. He knows the book. He can play by the book, but he also knows how to break it. Yeah,
exactly. And so, I mean, and so I'll go ahead and give the Reddits, /S here as we start to pass into the realm of satire and sarcasm, because I just want to say how much I cannot wait for them to make the other 9 Ultramarine captains. I mean, Cato's, they're going to do Cato eventually, right? It's not like they're going to replace Cato Sicarius.
I love that Cato model with the lightning claws. He looks like such a savage.
It's going to happen. So, okay, there's two of 10. Where are the other 9? Where are the other 8? I say 9 because if you read Dark Imperium, Gilliman makes Felix essentially the 11th captain as he breaks his own codex. And so we've got after Cato, so there's another one. I'm just excited to see the other 8 captains come into play.
Look, there are certain characters though. Like if they're going to venerate a character from a story and make a model, and it deserves it, like bring it on.
Yeah, well, Ventress definitely has enough behind him. Don't get me wrong. Like, there are plenty of other characters throughout this lore that could also get books based on that, or get models based on that concept. But Ventress is definitely one that, for those people there's a lot of people I know that are fans of Ultramarines because of Ventress specifically.
Yeah. Graham McNeil wrote those, didn't he?
Ah, man, I'll double check for you.
I think he did. Yeah, he's great too. I love his stuff. That's was one half of the Prospero Burns.
Yes, Graham McNeil.
Yeah. Stuff like just good stuff. But yeah, anytime if they're gonna bring a character that people love into a miniature form, I think that's so cool.
Yeah, same. I'm all for it. I actually want more of them. Like I want Dark Eldar players to get Duke and Baron back and stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, look. Like, also, if they make it as cool as, I mean, this model. I mean, I know we gave his like head sculpt a little grief, but at the same time, he probably comes with a helmet, and the sword that he has is epic as all get out.
Beautiful.
Like, if I don't know what the limitations on getting them is, but I think by the time people hear this, he might even be up for pre-order or order. And like, you probably want to get two if you can. Make yourself a cool captain.
Well, that's my thinking. Is like I might have a look at the sculpts when they come out, but I've been looking for a way to make a Primaris Azrael that isn't just a converted Lazarius. And he might be perfect as long as I can take off some of the Ultramarine stuff, like if his shoulder pads are interchangeable and things.
You cannot.
Shush. I'll do what I like.
He's got an Ultramarine symbol on basically every half inch of this model.
I'm super excited to see you do it.
I got knives. I can cut. I can file.
The whole sword pommel is an Ultramarine symbol. Like,
yeah, I know.
His shoulder pads.
He's got an
Ultramarine's belt buckle.
Swords. Do you know how many Dark Angel swords I own? Like all of them. Every cool Dark Angels anything comes with an awesome sword worth using on a captain.
His Iron Halo has an Ultramarine symbol. His leather, breechcloth or whatever his tassels have Ultramarine symbols at the bottom of them.
Just okay, cool, yeah.
I'm not trying to crush dreams.
I thought we didn't crush dreams here.
I'm not trying to crush dreams.
I thought that's what we were
Adam,
about.
I'm really excited to see what it looks like after you cut all the symbology off of it.
Honestly, I may have wanted to have another look at him before I said that.
He's
but
like
the first time I saw it, I'm like, oh yeah, I could make a good Azrael out of that. He's got a good pose.
The bolter is cool. Like, he's got a cool bolter. And actually, the whole model is cool. Like, no, the model is cool, but like, there are Ultramarine symbols all over it.
Just don't tell him, Paul, that he's got an Ultramarine symbol cut into his haircut.
You know what? I'm just going to do Lazarius. I'm just going to do Lazarius, and I'm just going to do so many conversions that I'm able to tell you it's Ventress, and you'll never know.
There you go. That's fair. That's fair. Look, if you're really good with the hobby knife, then knock yourself out.
I go all right.
Yeah, but his sword is pretty freaking epic, and he's got his armor. Like, even the boot style of his armor is different. Like, there are some unique things about this model. It's very cool. I'm saying if you're an Ultramarine player, you might want to make this into, not a Teeth of Terror, but a Burning Blade captain.
Yeah, he's like a mini Gilliman.
Yeah, no, he's he looks cool. I'd go for it.
Once just buy like 8 of them, and you can make all the other captains.
Well, that's the whole thing. Like, you see, he's the master of the fleet, so like they got to make the rest of them. They got to make the others for the chapter. I mean, the Tetrarchs and everything. That's what I was joking about. I think, how there's the 8 for Tau? I think that there should be the 11 or something. It should just be 11 Ultramarine captains, all Primaris, that like when they're close by, like I think at least 4 of them should have melta rifles. I think all of them should have built-in storm shields. And then if they're all within 8 inches of each other, just 8 inches of each other, all of them, right? Then they get +1 to hit, +1 to wound, and whatever, they should just be awesome. If you bring Gilliman, you automatically get 30 victory points.
You're on the mark there. But for every 5 you bring, once per game, you can remove 5 of them from the table and summon Gilliman, like Captain Planet style.
I think that's written in the Codex. That's actually the final page of the Codex Astartes. 4th
company, 5th company, and Heart, and Gilliman just forms.
or this, better yet, it's like the new. Of course, they'd only start it just for Ultramarines, but they get a it's a 2,000 point formation, right? It's the 11 captains. Each of them get a lieutenant, and they all have to be different models. It can't be the same lieutenant. And then you get Gilliman and Yvraine. I've just topped it off right there. I'm done. I'm sorry.
It is time to wrap it up, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, we've peaked.
Well, thank y'all for joining us for this jaunt down Ultramarines lore. Can't say that with a straight face.
Hey, that's canon, man.
Thank you to our special guest, Dan Abnett. Thank y'all for listening. Please like, share, and subscribe. We're going to continue to have things like the first part of the show further later on. Sure.
And every fourth show, we give you something like the back end of the show.
Well, yeah. Well, look, we're coming up on our anniversary soon of the show.
Oh,
so
snap.
I don't know what we're going to do. We're going to do something cool. I don't know what it is yet, but I know people don't want to miss it.
Amazing.
That's what I'm saying. Well, guys, thank y'all very much. Have a great night, and we will see y'all again next week.
Good night.
Take care.
Nobody puts baby in the corner.